Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Dibspminsight, where we provide you real-world experience on product and project management. I'm your host, Dibspminsight, and today we'll be deep diving into how a project manager can manage change within his or her projects. Change is inevitable, whether you are dealing with technology updates, stakeholder requests, or shifting market conditions. So how do you manage these changes without derailing the entire project in itself? To understand this better, let's start with the basics. Change management in projects refers to a process of identifying, documenting, approving, and implementing any change that affects the initial project scope, budget, timeline, or your deliverables in its entirety. You see, in theory, right, we expect our project to go as planned and everything just, goes boom, boom, and whatnot. But that's really the case, because in most cases, you find yourself implementing changes, maybe as a result of regulatory changes, as a result of fast market need, or based on stakeholder changing requirements, which is inevitable. Bearing this in mind, it's very important that you effectively manage the changes that happens in your project. Managing change effectively ensures that any alteration to your projects are controlled, documented, and do not necessarily impact your project negatively. It's like building a safety net to catch any potential risk in your project. But it's not just about controlling the changes, it's also about adapting to changes in your project. Without change management, you'll be exposing yourself to scope creep, where your project expands beyond its original boundaries, leading to missed deadlines, budget overrun, and frustrated stakeholders. Guys, take change management seriously. Now, let's deep dive into how to manage change in your project. I'll paint a typical scenario. So imagine you're managing a project and one of the stakeholders says, oh look, you need to actually modify a particular requirement, which is not in line with the initial agreed scope. Here are the steps you need to take to properly manage that request. First off, you shouldn't just invalidate their request because of course they are your stakeholders. You need to also, consider their request, see the feasibility of that request, and start by initiating the change management process, which I'll be explaining to you. Your first step is to identify and understand this change, right? Because if you don't really understand what the change is, how then would you know how to assess the impact of that change on your project? So first thing I do is to understand the client's request and what they are trying to actually change. The second step is to assess the impact of that change. What you need to do is discuss the change with your development team or your project team, have them analyze the work that needs to go into that change, basically how it affects the resource, how it affects your timeline, how it affects the system in its entirety, right? And basically looking at all the different touch points as it relates to your project and that change. At the end of that process of assessing the impact, you should be able to tell what will be affected in your project. Is it your timeline? Is it the budget? Is it the resource requirements? Or would it require an overhaul of an existing process that has actually been done? The next step is stakeholder communication. One of the most important roles you play is keeping everybody informed of the impact of this change. When a change is proposed by a stakeholder, make sure all stakeholders are aware of it. Transparency is key to avoid any surprises within your project. You might be asking how I communicate this change to stakeholders. So what I typically do is like a change request form that contains the request for change, the work that needs to go into the project to implement such change, the impact on my cost, time, resource, and the quality of the system. So in this case, once that document is provided, there's also a place for sign-off, which is basically stating that the stakeholder is supposed to sign off this particular proposal or change request before you proceed with that change. Once this has been provided to the stakeholders, the next step is to approve and decline. So basically, you are seeking for approval. This is where prioritization comes in. You need to weigh the benefit of this change against the risk and impact to your project. And in this case, if the stakeholder sees what you've proposed, your analysis of the change and its impact, and goes ahead to approve, then it means you can go ahead and execute that change. But in a case where the change is declined, it means that you just need to stick to the initial scope of your project. The next stage is implement and monitor. Once this change has been approved, ensure it is integrated into your project scope and you update all your project documents to incorporate that change. You're also required to monitor the progress and adjust other aspects of the project that are actually dependent on that change. So now, let's move to the common mistakes project managers make when managing a change. Most project managers actually make a big mistake of not properly documenting a change. Most times, stakeholders request for a change, maybe via an email, and you just go ahead to implement without documenting. Every change should actually be recorded, from who requested it and to how it affected your project. Basically, you are supposed to document the change, its impact, and also document the approval to actually proceed and change your project scope. Please note, this is very, very important and you shouldn't make a mistake. Without documenting your change, you can easily lose track of those adjustments and their impacts on your project. Another pitfall is also poor communication. Sometimes changes are made without informing the right people, leading to confusion and misalignment. To avoid this, you also need to communicate to all the stakeholders responsible for that project and make them know the change that has been requested, the impact of that change, the change that has been approved, and how it affects their own work in itself. To wrap this up, change management is very critical for any project manager. By having a clear process for managing a change, you can actually mitigate the risk of your projects going beyond its scope. And in this case, it's called scope creep. So, in order to recap, the processes to manage your change involves identifying the change, assessing the impact of the change, communicating to the stakeholders, approving or rejecting the change, and once the change has been approved, you then move to implement and monitor the change. For you to have stayed this long, it means you actually waited to the end of this podcast. Thanks for tuning into Dibspminsight. If you found this episode helpful, don't forget to subscribe and share it with other aspiring project managers. Until next time, keep managing your project like a pro.